You know that the video game industry is in trouble when we have games that are released without single player campaigns. You know the video game industry is in trouble when we have games that are monetized heavily for things like weapon skins, character skins, power boost, and other types of nonsense. You know video games are in trouble when a game that is less than 10 years old has its server shut down just a few years after its release because no one is playing it anymore. And yet, these gaming companies want you to spend $60. And for a lot of gamers, they'll go out and, they'll buy video games, brand new, $60 that are just multiplayer and nothing else. They'll go out and they'll spend extra money to get that neat character skin that at the end of the day, they may not use that much. They'll go out and they'll buy collector's editions and deluxe editions and re-released games over and over again so they can be up to date with the latest trend of what's new. And this is part of the reason why the video game industry is in the state that it's in now. This is the problem with the video game industry, part 8. Multiplayer being prioritized over single player. When it comes to the discussion of multiplayer in video games, multiplayer has a place in gaming just like single player does. Multiplayer is absolutely essential for certain games these days. For example, fighting games. It's absolutely essential for a fighting game to have some type of competitive online component, and without it, the game just feels very barren because most fighting games just do not have the content to back up them just being single player and nothing else. And also for the majority of first-person shooter games, those types of games, they also need a multiplayer component because, once again, those games also do not have the content most of the time to justify them just being single player and absolutely have nothing else to offer the player in terms of content. But then we have certain types of games where multiplayer actually hurts the game, and you have certain types of games that absolutely do not need multiplayer. In fact, shoehorning multiplayer into certain games has kind of hurt certain video games in the past. For example, Tomb Raider 2013. Tomb Raider 2013 is a great video game, but Tomb Raider 2013 had a shoehorned in multiplayer mode. How much better would the single player campaign have been if they just focused all of their resources and development efforts into the single player portion of the game? Now, obviously, it can be argued that you have different teams that are working on different parts of these games. You have a team for the single player campaign, and then you have a team for the multiplayer campaign. But quite simply, that's not always the case. If you have a single development team, with certain studios, you only have one team that develops everything. That's development time and resources that's being put into one single aspect of a game. And then you have studios that do have different teams that work on different things. But it would be more beneficial for certain teams to just work on a new project instead of having them spend more time to make something that not a whole lot of people are going to play in the first place. For example, was it really necessary for Square Enix to make a multiplayer mode for Final Fantasy 15? How many people even played Comrades? I'd imagine not a whole lot of people played that portion of the game, especially considering it was released long after the launch of the initial game itself. Then you have the multiplayer mode that was in The Last of Us, which is a fantastic multiplayer mode. It's one of the best that I've played. It's one of the best that I've seen in any video game that I've experienced. But realistically, how many people actually played the multiplayer mode in that game extensively or simply at all? I'd imagine not too many. Maybe a third of the game's audience played the multiplayer mode and really found it fun enough to continue playing it for an extended period of time. Most of the people that bought and played The Last of Us played it for the single player, and the single player portion of the game was the game. That was the bulk of the game's content. Now, I've made it clear that I absolutely detest certain games that have been released this console generation for various reasons. Games like God of War 2018, and games like what I'm showing on the screen right now, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I can't stand these games for various reasons. The least of which is not limited to the combat system in these games, the story that these games tell, the length, the open world portion of these games, so on and so forth. But at least these games didn't have a shoehorned in multiplayer mode. The game developers took all of their time and assets, all of their resources, and the full combined creative strength of their development teams to make one thing, and that was a good single player experience. Multiplayer in the old days of previous console generations was meant as a side activity after you completed the main game. After you completed the main game, then you could go back and go online or whatever the case was, or go locally and play with friends, family, strangers, whatever. But these days you have all these different video games that don't have any type of single player content at all. All it is multiplayer. Multiplayer, multiplayer, multiplayer. And then these game developers, they'll try and be slick and market these games based around the concept of building your own community, being a part of this unified whole. Then they'll throw in buzzwords like social media and phone apps and different nonsense to keep you engaged. And they end up sabotaging their own game, because essentially what happens is that the gameplay in these games ends up being extremely shallow, because they didn't really put in a whole lot of time and effort to make these games. The intention the entire time behind these games was for you, the player, to go out and spend money on microtransactions, spend money on that character skin, or that new weapon skin, or that new set of maps, or those new characters that they just added to the game. That's the intention behind these multiplayer-centric games. And the development studios under them, they make games that are multiplayer only because they're easier to monetize and they're easier to produce compared to a good single-player game that doesn't have any of that. Because with a single-player game, even in today's market for video games, even in the market as it exists in the modern day, the most that they can really do is give you some character skins here and there, and usually they'll give you some DLC expansions, but not a whole lot, and they won't charge so much for it. On the flip side, with a multiplayer game, the development team can make dozens upon dozens of weapon skins. They can make dozens upon dozens of different character sprites and put like a little cheap price tag on those items to sell on these digital online marketplaces. And they know that people will go out and they'll buy them. They make money off of those things, and lots of it. For someone who probably isn't a gamer, if they took a look at these things, they probably would wonder why someone would spend money to have a fictional character in a video game look a certain way. But people actually do find value in that. And so people will go out and they'll buy different packs. They'll buy different microtransactions so they can get a unique look for their character in the game. They'll go out and they'll spend money to get more maps to extend the life of the game. They'll go out and they'll spend money on DLC expansions. They'll go out and they'll buy microtransactions so they can have their weapons look a certain way in the game. Now, the reason this is an issue in the video game community is because, similar to what I was discussing in part 7 of this series, DLC, microtransactions, and season passes, you end up spending more money on video games than you probably should. And then the worst part is about these games is that they're really seasonal products, these multiplayer centric games. So you're never really buying a complete definitive version, because within the next year or within the next few years, depending on if it's a yearly franchise or not, they'll just release another version of the game that you already bought, and the process starts all over again with the monetization. And then within each person's individual social circle, it becomes a thing of, oh, well, I got to get the new thing because all my buddies have the new game, so I got to get it too, so I can be up to date with everyone. And the only thing that you're doing is making these companies more wealthy. You're giving them more money for lazy content. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to make a multiplayer game. All they have to do, if it's a shooter, is make some maps, create some of the same game types that you've seen in dozens upon dozens of games over the years. Deathmatch, team deathmatch, capture the flag, all of that shit. make some character models or whatever, different classes, class types, and from that point, the game really markets itself, and then the players will make up their own experience. Now compare that to an actual single-player game that doesn't have any multiplayer, where the game developers have to come up with a story. They have to come up with characters. They have to be more creative with their level design. They now have to come up with answers as far as game length. What type of game is it? Is it an open world game? Is it a more linear type of thing? Most games these days are open world. So that means at least 3 to 4 years minimum worth of a development time. They have to be more picky when it comes to the budget of the game. Instantly, everything just becomes significantly harder and more challenging when a development studio is trying to make a good single player game. A multiplayer game, a multiplayer only game, not much effort goes into it by comparison. And like I said, the worst part is when they shut down those servers for the game that you bought, because it doesn't have any single player content and it's a multiplayer only game that you need a subscription in order to play at all. Once they shut the servers down, that's it. You may as well use the disc as a fucking cup holder. That's a complete waste of money and time. And another thing I've noticed with these types of games is that the player base for them usually drops pretty quickly. People will play them for about a week or two, which is around the time that they come out. And then you'll have certain people, a certain amount of people that will stick with the game over an extended period of time. But usually the player base drops and people stop playing the game. Now, any game that has an online multiplayer component, usually, no matter what it is or how old it is, you'll always find someone who's playing online. But for some games, that just isn't the case. With some games, the player base drops so quickly, so rapidly, to the point where you wonder why you even spent money on the damn thing at all. A good example that's recent that I can think of is Dead or Alive 6. Hardly anyone is playing that fucking game now, online. Why did they even bother? Why did I even bother spending money on it? So you have games like The Division, Destiny, Evolve, Overwatch, and recently this year, Anthem. All of these games, it's just nothing but multiplayer. And the experience is extremely shallow, it's thin, and there's not much to it. This is why Call of Duty gets criticized every year for being the same thing. Because it's gotten to a point where it's no longer about the content of the game. Rather, it's about how much money these development studios and the publishers that they work under can get out of you, the player. That's the entire point. And I would much prefer it if things just stay traditional, where you have a good single player game, a good single player experience, and then if they added multiplayer later, perhaps, then you have some extra shit that you can do on the side. But considering the way the industry works these days, quality over quantity in the eyes of these major video game publishers, they view that as a formula for a loss on their investment into these products. And so they're going to keep releasing games like this. Fortunately, you do have great single-player games that are released now, but even those, as I stated in part 6 of this series, are just starting to copy each other to the point where there's no more creativity. Everything's open world, everything has a Souls-like combat system, or is some type of ripoff of the Dark Souls series. Everything has a bunch of random, numerous, boring-ass fetch quests. Everything has these cliche RPG elements. And now the solution to this problem goes from, oh, just buy single-player games and just ignore the multiplayer-only ones, to, well, shit, the single-player games aren't good either. You may as well wait for a price drop with everything now. And I'll be discussing that more in the final part of this series. But for the time being, that's the video, and I have 2 more parts of this series. And I do plan on making one final video after part 10, which will summarize all 10 parts in one video.